problems presented by this hypothetical are commonly tested, just about universally tested. You can count on seeing some of these issues on the upcoming bar examination. Take a look at the call of the question, and we see that this is much closer to being a short answer question series than a really complicated essay. Look at question 1. What interest does each of the following have in Blackacre? Dan, Sam, Carol, discuss. This is a pretty simple question to outline. We'll have a separate section on each of these three parties. 2. What rights do Sam and Carol have with respect to the profits in the years from 1986 to 95 and to the rents from 92 to 95? Discuss. Again, we will have two sections, one for each claimant, but we can't organize it in any more depth before we actually examine what happened in the question. And then question 3, is Carol liable to Art for any of the monetary losses suffered by Art from 1980 through 1985? Discuss. This looks like basically a short answer question, and as it turns out, it is. So by looking at these three calls of the question, we know that we are being asked about real property, and we know that we're going to have to answer a series of questions as opposed to doing some elaborate analysis. But as it turns out, the analysis that is required is just about as difficult as it gets with regard to concurrent ownership. Go to the top of the problem, and we see Fred. Fred is the grantor, a widower who leaves Blackacre to his three kids, A, B, and C, and they're all joint tenants. So at the time of the grant, Art and Bob and Carol are joint tenants, and they have the right of survivorship. As we look carefully at the paragraph, we see that only Art chooses to occupy the property, and that means that Bob and Carol never occupy Blackacre, only Art does. Now, does Art's occupation of this property by himself adversely affect the rights of Bob and Carol? Answer, no. Bob and Carol have not been ousted from this property. Art is the only one occupying the property, but Bob and Carol are still joint tenants, and they still have the right of survivorship. Now, look at what happens in paragraph 2. This is what complicates the situation and muddies the waters. Art loses a bunch of money. Let's pause for a moment and consider that. Art is the sole tenant who is actually occupying this farm. The other joint tenants aren't there. The joint tenant that's occupying the farm, Art, has lost money farming during the years 1980 to 1985. That's the third call of the question. Now, are the other joint tenants liable as a result? And the answer is no. When we've got one joint tenant in possession, and that joint tenant is engaging in operations like farming, the other joint tenants are not liable for the losses, and by the way, they also don't get to share in the profits. He's the guy doing the work, he is the guy who gets to keep the money. And it is as a result of the labor of Art that profits or losses are going to be made, and so Art will bear the burden or reap the benefit of his success. And it turns out that he loses money. And in paragraph 2, Art quitclaims his interest to Dan. So now we have to consider Dan's interest. Can Dan become a joint tenant along with Bob and Carol? Answer, no. Dan takes as a tenant in common. Now the next question, and the highest complexity part of this fact pattern, is this. Does Dan's obtaining an interest in the property serve to sever the joint tenancy between Bob and Carol? I would conclude no, it does not. Bob and Carol remain joint tenants, but throughout my analysis, I will lead with that approach, and I will also consider what the result would be in the event that the quitclaim between Art and Dan would sever the joint tenancy between Bob and Carol. Now, in paragraph 3, we see that Bob dies, and at the moment of Bob's death, Sam is the heir to Bob. And here we get into another of the most complicated issues with regard to concurrent ownership. But as we look at it closely through this example, we see that it isn't really that hard at all. Let's assume for a moment that the quitclaim between Art and Dan does not serve to break the joint tenancy between Bob and Carol. All right? So Bob and Carol are joint tenants. What's the key aspect of that relationship? Answer, the right of survivorship. So at the moment that Bob dies in 1990, if the relationship between Bob and Carol is that of joint tenants with the right of survivorship, Carol gets all of Bob's interest instantly, and thus Bob doesn't have an interest in the property to leave to his sole heir, Sam. All right? That's the most complicated question presented. And once we see that, everything else makes sense and the entire problem falls into place. Now, if you don't happen to know that black letter law, and if you aren't alert to considering the issues of severance that are raised by the quitclaim between Art and Dan, you're in trouble. And that's why you need to do these hypothetical questions and as many others as you can get your hands on. The more you practice the material, the more you will see how it's tested. This material here is being tested ritualistically. We'll see fact patterns like this in every state of the union that releases questions to their essays. And the multi-state essay examination is no exception. This is a very standard set of facts dealing with concurrent ownership. So now we see Bob's death, the survival by Sam, and we see from 1986 to 1995, Dan is able to operate this farm a lot more profitably than Art ever was. Is Dan going to have to share those profits? Again, the answer is going to be no. And then, finally, we also see that there was a tenant occupying a cottage on the land, and Dan was profiting from that rental income. Now we have to pause for a moment and realize that that's a different type of income than income being made from the tenant's own labor in operating a farm. Rental income is more passive, and it's a different type of income, one that must be shared with the other owners of the land. So now we see the call of the question once more in place after we get a 10-year statute of limitations with regard to adverse possession. So turn the page and take a look at the way that I have organized an elaborate response to this question. You'll see that my organization is meticulous, but ultimately it serves to do a very rigorous job of organizing the analysis. And what it boils down to, once again, is carefully and meticulously explaining and discussing the legal relationships between these parties. This is another real property hypothetical that really is a pure property question. We're not dealing with issues from torts or contracts here. We're dealing purely with the interests that these parties have in the land and in the income and losses that are generated by doing business on the land. So, the ownership interest in Blackacre, we must talk about Dan, we must talk about Sam, and we've got to talk about Carol. Well, what is Dan's interest in this property? Art quitclaimed his interest to Dan. The best way to characterize Dan is as a tenant in common with Bob and Carol, who are joint tenants. But Dan's got another theory of ownership with regard to Blackacre, and that would be adverse possession. We've got to find a home for the facts that deal with adverse possession, in particular, the fact that they give us the adverse possession statute. Now, once again, we can use an elaborate checklist for adverse possession, but I want to focus your attention on how to think about the issue. And the basic ideas behind adverse possession involve the claimant's mental element, the physical occupation of the property, and the time element. So, let's look carefully. Does Dan's occupation satisfy the hostility requirement, the mental element of adverse possession? It's a fairly close call. He has received a quitclaim deed. Does he believe himself to be the true owner of the whole property, or is he aware of the existence of the other tenants? We don't really know what the answer to that question is. If he is unaware of the existence of the other tenants, he actually might satisfy the mental element of adverse possession. However, the fact that the other tenants never were ousted from the property substantially weakens the adverse possession claim. Has he physically occupied the property? Yes, But again, the failure to oust the true owners probably defeats, or certainly it weakens, the adverse possession claim. Has Dan's occupation satisfied the time element of the statute? Answer, yes. 10 years is the requirement. So what's the result? What is Dan's interest in this property? I conclude that Dan is a tenant in common with Bob and Carol, who remain joint tenants. You might disagree with me, but if you do, there's two places where you can disagree with me. You can either conclude that Dan wins title via adverse possession, or you can claim that he is a tenant in common with Bob and Carol, who also are tenants in common as a result of Dan's coming into the deal, severing the joint tenancy relationship altogether. Now, if you reach that conclusion, I think you'd be wrong. I think that would be a black letter law error. Now, many states don't care so much about your conclusions on the essays, so long as you analyze rigorously and find a home for the facts with regard to elements of the legal analysis. But it seems to me that the better answer here, substantively, is that Dan's adverse possession claim fails because of the lack of ouster, and his true ownership interest is as a tenant in common with the joint tenants Bob and Carol. Next, we consider Sam's claim. Sam is Bob's sole heir. If the relationship between Bob and Carol remains that of joint tenants, despite Dan's coming into the relationship, then Sam takes nothing, because Carol would have the right to obtain Bob's interest at the moment of Bob's death, based on the fact that Carol and Bob were joint tenants with the right of survivorship. Now, if we have the opposite result, if Dan's coming into this property severs the joint tenancy relationship between Bob and Carol, turning them into tenants in common, then, under those circumstances, Sam would inherit his father's interest as a tenant in common. So my conclusion is that Bob and Carol's joint tenancy is not severed, so Dan ultimately becomes a tenant in common with Carol, who owns a 2/3 interest. Next, we turn to the much simpler and much shorter issues. First, Sam and Carol's rights to the profit and rents. I conclude that Sam's got no interest at all because his dad was a joint tenant rather than a tenant in common. But even if Sam did have an interest in the property, Sam would not have any interest in the profits. He might have an interest in the rents. I would hold ultimately that Carol gets 2/3 of the rents as the 2/3 owner of the property, but that she gets 0% of the profits from the farming operations because she didn't do anything to contribute to those profits. Finally, we turn to question 3, Carol's possible liability to Art for Art's losses between 1980 and 1985, and the answer here, the shortest and simplest of the group, is that Carol doesn't have any liability to Art. She's not liable to Art at all for the same reason that she's not entitled to share the profits that were made from the farming operations as Dan conducted them. She was a tenant who was not in possession of the property, and as a result, she's not entitled to any share of income from the farming operations, although she is entitled to a share of the rents, and she is not liable for any of Art's losses during the time that Art was unsuccessfully operating that farm. And that wraps up a discussion of what I think you will agree is just about as complicated a concurrent ownership question as any set of bar examiners could come up with.